You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host from New York City, Ankit Panda, senior editor at The Diplomat, and I'm delighted today to be joined by a special guest. Joining me all the way from Sydney is Ashley Townshend, Director of Foreign Policy and Defense at the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney. Ash, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Ankit. Good to speak with you.
It's a pleasure. I know I haven't run into you at any conferences or anything in a while, but I think that's becoming a little bit of a trend this year. So as listeners might surmise with Ash on the show, I am hoping to talk a little bit about Australia today because Australia has recently put out a couple interesting strategic documents, which I think merit close analysis and discussion. So before we get into the discussion, I want to talk a little bit about 2016. So in 2016, Australia put out a defense white paper. And as some of you might know, 2016 is probably a strange year to do an exercise like that in hindsight, given that quite a bit changed in the world in 2017 with the election of Donald Trump to the U.S. presidency and the subsequent decline in U.S.-China relations. And sort of acknowledging those developments indirectly and directly in some ways, Australia has just issued on July 1st a defense strategic update. We'll talk a little bit about what exactly that is, and a force structure plan for its military, basically laying out how its strategic priorities have changed and been updated to reflect some new strategic realities in the neighborhood. And it's an interesting exercise because few countries, I think, undertake an exercise like this. And I'll just quote a little bit from the Australian Department of Defense's description of why they felt the need to update the 2016 Defense White Paper. While the drivers of change identified in the 2016 Defense White Paper persist, they have accelerated faster than anticipated. Australia now faces an environment of increasing strategic competition. The introduction of more capable military systems enabled by technological change, and the increasingly aggressive use of diverse gray zone tactics to coerce states under the threshold for a conventional military response. So Ash, I'm delighted to have you on because I know you follow security issues in Australia and in the Indo-Pacific quite closely. Tell us a little bit about the background conditions in Australia that led to this defense strategic update manifesting.
Thanks, Ankit. I think your choice takeaways from the update document just there really do get to the heart of it. It's probably fair to say that almost as soon as the 2016 Defence White Paper was published, analysts, officials, the think tank community in Australia were all starting to talk about how it was rapidly going out of date. That had to do with not just the election in the United States that you alluded to, but I think as, if not more importantly, the uptick in China's use of coercive statecraft here in the Indo-Pacific, both specifically vis-a-vis Australia, as well as more generally with regards to our regional interests insofar as the way that Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, in Northeast Asia, in maritime and continental Southeast Asia, in the Pacific, has become increasingly assertive, and how China has become increasingly willing to prosecute its interests in the grey zone, in addition to and under the shadow of its increasingly potent conventional military capabilities. That's the context. And the obviously effects of the US election in terms of an administration that, at least over which initially there were significant questions raised about where the alliance would fit in its global priorities. I think many of those for Australia have been assuaged, although not for all regional allies. In light of those questions and in light of China's behavior, the 2016 White Paper seemed really for most of us to be just too optimistic by the time we got to the end of 2017.
Right, and a big focus in the 2016 White Paper was on the notion of the rules-based order, the rules-based international order. That phrase appears all throughout that document, and it is very much the objective that Australia is going to be a partner that walks shoulder to shoulder with the United States in defending that order. One of the reasons I brought up the U.S. election is because I think that sort of language about the rules-based international order in a U.S.-Australia allied context does appear a bit antiquated in hindsight, particularly with the Trump presidency having gone the way that it has. So some of the commentary that I've seen, and I'd love to get your thoughts on whether you agree or disagree, is that this update is in a way Australia still acknowledging the U.S. alliance as the cornerstone of its defense policy, but also increasingly taking more of the realities into account and the fact that it might have to go it on its own to some extent. How do you view that?
Look, yeah, I think there are 2 points there, Ankit. On the first, I agree with you language around the rules-based order and preserving it does seem a little antiquated in light of developments over the last 4 years. Having said that, it is still a primary objective of Australia to do our part for the regional order and to contribute to its upholding, both with the United States as well as with other like-minded allies and partners. I think in terms of the lexicon here, the really interesting shift has been, as you say, from a very large number of references to the rules-based order in that 2016 document to, in this white paper, a very significant treatment of the term grey zone coercion, which didn't really appear in the 2016 document and which is in this one, a dozen times or so. That is an interesting development which we can reflect on. But to your question, the second point about the alliance, I think it's fair to say my read of the document is that this is in many ways our response to and our answer to the United States National Defense Strategy of 2018. And the reason I say that is because this document is very clear about regional prioritization. The 2016 white paper listed our strategic defense objectives as being the defense of Australia, the defense of our region, and the pursuit of global interests and objectives around the world. This white paper zeroes in on the near Indo-Pacific for Australia. The second part of that is that this white paper, although it does talk about defence self-reliance, what it really is doing here is demonstrating an Australia that is, because of all of the reasons we've discussed, bulking up, pursuing advanced capabilities, networking those capabilities, spending more on its defense, taking a more active role in the region so that it can be both more able to achieve effects independently in service of shared and common objectives, both of the United States, but also of our near and close partners like Indonesia, like Malaysia, Singapore in Southeast Asia, like our Pacific friends, and like obviously US treaty allies, Japan and Korea in the region.
Mm-hmm. And, putting myself in the shoes of somebody in the Trump administration, a lot of what you just said is something that the administration has been pushing for allies to do, to spend more on their defense, to bear a greater share of the burden in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to security. So that's interesting, and particularly the link to the National Defense Strategy, I think is an important observation. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about hardware, which you alluded to. So the controversial part, I guess, of the Defense Strategic Update is Australia's shift not really shift, but increase in interest in acquiring more capable strike platforms with certain standoff capabilities like the long-range anti-ship missile and a few other things under consideration. And of course, there's cash being put behind these procurements. The Defense Strategic Update does promise the outlay of a significant amount of Australian dollars over the next decade. So there is, a clear strategic purpose in terms of what the strategic objective is, what are the capabilities necessary to achieve that, and what amount of money will be spent on acquiring these systems. Let me ask you, though, in terms of deterrence, how has Australian thinking about its deterrence requirements shifted, especially in light of this new focus on grey zone coercion?
Yeah, look, lots in that, Ankit. I think first, in terms of the capabilities, you're right. One of the headline-grabbing developments announced with the update was that Australia would proceed with the purchase of 200 long-range anti-ship missiles from the United States, which will be at least initially fitted to our existing Super Hornets and in time to other airframe, and that will give us a long-range standoff capability of the kind that we haven't had for some time. Beyond that, I think the more significant development or planned development really is the dollars that will be invested into R&D with regards to hypersonics and other forms of strike platforms at both land, air, sea, as well as cyber capabilities. And here we're really talking about significant money in the context of the Australian defence budget. Just to give you some ballpark numbers here, across the board, we're talking about upwards of potentially $20 billion to be invested in R&D and long-range strike capabilities, as well as in unmanned combat systems over the course of the next decade. Our annual defence budget will stand at the end of the decade around $70 billion. That puts things in perspective a little bit about just how much this is now becoming a priority. How we will use these new capabilities gets to your second question, which is about deterrence. Australia is now getting back into the deterrence game in terms of the framework of this update to hold adversaries and to at risk from greater distances to hold adversaries at risk at greater distances from Australia by holding their interests as well as their infrastructure at risk in order to preserve our own interests is the framing. Having said that, I think that we are only really at the beginning of the process with regards to the operational concepts that are going to accompany those. LRASMs on Australian aircraft in numbers of 200 would be shortly exhausted, even in a coalition environment in Northeast Asia. I think that those particular platforms will have a lot of utility in maritime Southeast Asia, but how they will be combined with other forms of conventional military activity, the sorts of threats that will be issued around which states in the region, a lot of that work is still to be done.
And so when it comes to the acquisition of these platforms and the application of deterrence, I mean, really Australia isn't straying away from relying on deterrence by denial. This is primarily about granting Canberra the ability to basically hold its littoral and have greater access into Southeast Asia. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The frame I would use is we are seeking to ensure that we continue to have access and influence in a part of the Indo-Pacific that is becoming increasingly contested, and where we believe Chinese objectives are to reduce our access and influence. Now, some of the specific ways that could happen that the the update mentions is the establishment of a foreign military base in the Southwest Pacific. It's not named that could be a Chinese one, but it's no secret that is particularly an interest and a concern that Australia has down the line. I think that's a good example because at face value, the acquisition of long-range strike platforms are not particularly well equipped to deal with that particular eventuality. So how Australia will go about shaping the environment, working more with partners, working on the ground with Southeast Asian, in this case Pacific countries, in order to dissuade, deter, disrupt the pursuit of, for instance, a Chinese military or navy base in the Pacific, I think is where really you'd want to put your bets when you're thinking about how Australia's ADF is going to interpret this new guidance. That's just one example. When it comes to the South China Sea, I think a striking revelation of former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull in his memoirs a couple of weeks ago was that one of the reasons for hesitation around freedom of navigation operations, in his view, was the concern that Australia would be isolated without its own capacity to, if you like, have some escalation options to provide the confidence for Australia to undertake a FONOP, noting that he couldn't necessarily rely on the United States always being there. It's not a stretch to think that Australian aircraft with long-range standoff weapons might now be able to provide that sort of confidence to ships on the water.
Right. And so I do want to get to the Australia-China relationship a little bit. But before I do that, I mean, we often, we've been talking a lot about great powers, the U.S. and China, but Australia obviously has a lot of important relationships in Southeast Asia, particularly with countries like Indonesia comes to mind in particular. How has the Defense Strategic Update been viewed in these countries?
Well, the Indonesian Defence Minister, Prabowo Subianto, welcomed the update on its release. And Australia, obviously, as you would expect, undertook a very comprehensive set of pre-briefings to all of our regional partners, including China, including Indonesia and others in the region, to read them into what and why Australia was going to be doing in this defence update. So you would expect that. But it is significant that Indonesia and others in Southeast Asia have also welcomed this, including the Philippines. It is significant because one of the reasons that Australia has in the past been hesitant around its public discussion of or policy pursuit of long-range strike platforms has absolutely to do with the illusion in your question that it could be misperceived in the region or perceived accurately in the region as a capability which down the line might pose strategic concerns to our near friends in the region. So the fact that the Indonesian defense minister in particular has singled this out as something, as an update which is a positive contribution to regional security and something which he understands the motivations of, again, they're alluding to China's step up in assertiveness in the region, is, I think, a very significant development. That could well pave the way for further coordination and collaboration between Australia and Indonesia, both with the United States and independently at a bilateral level, when it comes to exercises, operations, patrols, and so forth in and around contested parts of the South China Sea in the region. I'll draw your attention to just there at the weekend, the 4th of July, approval of the sale of Ospreys to Indonesia by the United States. Australia and the US work with Ospreys. Australia doesn't have them, but works with the US and its Ospreys with the Marine Forces based in Darwin. And there's often been talk about bringing Indonesia more closely into that particular rotational deployment. And beyond that, earlier in the year, the reported Australia-Indonesia intelligence sharing agreement, which would see Australia be in a position to provide sort of more directly operationally relevant intelligence to Indonesian forces with regards to what's happening, what China is doing in parts of the South China Sea and around the Tuna Islands, for example. These are all signs of the way that Australia, I think, will take a more active role in working with third parties in the region who are on the front line of all of this. The defence update signals the shaping part of our defence strategy as being the first and most important part, and I think that is there. That is one example of how Australia will work with third parties to actually take a direct stake in the management of regional frictions, in the maintenance of conventional deterrence. That can happen independently of the United States, and again, with the shared objective of the alliance and partner network in mind.
Mm-hmm. No, that's fascinating, especially that bit about Indonesia and the Ospreys. That's definitely something to keep an eye on after the approval of that sale. I think I saw a few reports that the Indonesians are actually still a little confused about whether they're going to move ahead with the Ospreys, but certainly something to keep an eye on.
Well, they've got the right now.
Yeah,
exactly.
They have the right to procure that if they deem fit. So. The elephant in the room, or the dragon in the room, so to speak, China. I know Australia has had certainly a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific have had an eventful 6 months with China since particularly the beginning of the pandemic this year. Maybe for our listeners who haven't really been keeping up with Australia-China relations, if you could just in maybe a minute or two tell us a little bit about Australia's year with China. I know it's been a rocky one, but it's just I think important context for this conversation.
Absolutely. I think it's fair to say it's been a very, very difficult year in the Australia-China relationship, and that was coming off the back of a difficult few years where Australia has really been in the doghouse. China is our largest trading partner, and therefore is a country that has always occupied the minds of the highest levels of Australian government and business with regards to maintaining a good relationship. But going back probably 3 years now, the Australian government, and really in a bipartisan way, has taken a much stronger line with regards to defending and standing up for Australian interests when they were perceived to be at risk by Chinese initiatives or objectives. The introduction of counter-foreign interference legislation 2 years ago into the Australian Parliament was one example of that. The banning of Huawei in Australia's 5G network was another. This year, the initiative that has really caused a lot of disturbance in that relationship has been the government's, again, with bipartisan support, push for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19, which was finally adopted at the World Health Organization in May. But prior to that, when initially announced as an Australian initiative, led to a very sustained and focused campaign of disinformation, propaganda and intimidation by Beijing, by its consulates and embassy here in Australia, by the media and online actors, to cast Australia really as a disruptor, as a country that was acting at the behest of Washington, which wasn't the case with regards to the COVID-19 inquiry, and then threatening and doling out economic coercion against Australia, sanctioning, or at least in our framework it would be sanctioning, but banning Australian barley exports into China at around the cost of $1 billion to Australia, as well as banning 4 Australian beef exporters from selling their wares in the mainland. These are, on the overall scale of the bilateral trade relationship, small numbers. The trade relationship is ultimately grounded in the sale of minerals, but also tourism, exports, and agriculture are big components of that. We've seen the Chinese officials threatening Australia around students and tourists that they may not seek to come back to this country, or they may be prevented from doing so because of developments in China. That's where we are in the relationship right now, and that really is the context for the update last week.
Yeah, and I bet the folks working on that update have been working on it for a while, and this has, like you said, Australia's had a few difficult years with China, but certainly I think developments in 2020 have shown that this really does remain a problem. So we are running a little short on time, but I wanted to ask you something that I like to kind of dig into in these discussions on geopolitics in the region, which is when it comes to democracies and sort of plans for implementing strategy and procuring certain systems, something I think we should talk a little bit more about is the domestic politics. I know Australia's had a rocky time with prime ministers coming and going here and there, but broadly speaking, the strategic direction of Australian foreign policy has remained the same. So when it comes to this defense strategic update, how robust do you think this will be in the face of potential political upheaval in the Australian system?
I think it is, as you suggested, it is going to stand the test of time, and barring any major changes in political settings here, and I think an election wouldn't be one of those. The capability spending plan and the dollar amount attached to it outlined in the update is going to continue. And, there's already reason for being confident that that's the case. Although we've seen a change in leadership within the ruling Liberal National Party coalition over the last 4 years, which has seen a different Prime Minister usher in the update from Malcolm Turnbull, the Prime Minister who put in the Defence White Paper in 2016, and only did so very soon after his predecessor was pipped at the post, Tony Abbott, who was the Prime Minister that started the Defence White Paper update. Although you've already seen those changes, there's a remarkable degree of consistency with regards to spending at or above 2% of GDP and sustaining that through very serious and detailed budget papers and capability acquisition programming that supports the Defence Strategic Update, or indeed the White Paper. The dollar amount hasn't really increased significantly in this update. The significance is that it's been the gradual and considerable ongoing increases are now going to be sustained through to the end of the decade, which will see Australia spending well above inflation through into 2030. That is not something that many other Western militaries can say at this point in time, particularly in the context of COVID-19. So I think that will continue. And the reason for that is, again, the ballast, which is the bipartisan position, at its core, really, that Australia does need to be strong when it comes to charting both a more independent and a more regionally focused and active foreign and defence policy in the region. The Foreign Policy White Paper, the Defence Strategic Update were both welcomed by the Labor Party opposition. And so I think for Voices and your listeners in Washington, I would be very confident that this document is not just a statement of intent, but is in fact where Australia is going.
Right. And, as an American with an interest in Asia-Pacific security, I definitely find it to be reassuring. So there is that.
Very good.
Look, Ash, I wanna thank you for making this work across all these time zones. I know it's never easy to bring an Aussie on the podcast, but happy to have you.
Not at all, Ankit. Look, thanks so much for having me, and appreciate the discussion.
My pleasure. For listeners, if you've been a subscriber to the podcast but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate if you could do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. We'd love for you to keep up with future coverage on this podcast. Finally, before we close, a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.